thank you very much. That was an extraordinary introduction, and as I was listening, I thought, actually, Michael, what we learned from that introduction is what a generous sensibility you have, and thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and to share with you some of my more recent reflections on public assembly. I'm aware that some of my references are derived from conceptual frameworks developed within U.S. legal and political history, but my task today is to try to depart from some of those frameworks in order to grasp some key features of public assembly that we've witnessed in recent years. Of course, the phrase, "we the people," is one that initiates the legal break from Britain by the United States, but it's also a phrase that is implicitly invoked in any number of public assemblies that do not share the legal framework of the United States. Etienne Balibar's title, "We, the People of Europe?" is a case in point. In fact, it is rare that such a phrase is actually spoken or written, and yet does its performative force get communicated by other means? I take my point of departure in this talk not only from the Occupy movements, but from other kinds of assemblies that are appearing precisely as public space is either sold off and or subject to various kinds of securitarian control. And also, as I note, that public education movements in Chile and in Montreal, for instance, certainly throughout Europe, are emerging, in which students object to new cuts and the standardization of the excellence protocols. I don't mean to suggest that all of these assemblies are the same, or even that they enunciate perfectly parallel structures. I would rather take the occasion to ask, through what means the claim to public space is being made? If it is not always in language that names and forms the people as a unity, is it perhaps taking place with other bodily resources through silence, concerted movement, stillness, persistent clustering of bodies in public space throughout the day and night that has characterized the Occupy movement? Perhaps these recent assemblies prompt us to ask whether we need to revise our ideas of public space in order to take account of the forms of alliance and solidarity that are only partially dependent on the ability to appear in the public square. That was, of course, Hannah Arendt's famous claim, one of them, that politics not only requires a space of appearance, but that bodies do appear. For her, appearing was a precondition of speaking, and only public speech really counted as action in the political sphere. In revolution, she told us, there is certainly acting in concert or plural action, but could she allow the plural movements of bodies to articulate the we, that plurality considered so essential to democracy? How would we understand public assembly as a political enactment that is, in fact, distinct from speech? I will tell you in advance that this paper was written with Gezi Park in mind, and an earlier version was given in Istanbul in September. You are receiving the revised version today. There are, of course, many examples, recent examples, of people coming together, forming a way of speaking as a collective, demanding a change in policy, exposing the absence of state legitimacy, and or calling for the dissolution of government. Although Tahrir Square seemed for a time to emblematize the democratic power of public assemblies, we've seen how counter-revolutions deploy their own ideas of who the people are, even if they bring on police and political authorities, even as they bring on police and military authorities to attack and imprison the people. So if we let this developing example guide our thinking, then no one popular assembly comes to represent the entirety of the people, but each positing of the people through assembly risks or invites a set of conflicts that in turn prompt a growing set of doubts about who the people are. So let us assume that no one assembly can rightly become the basis for generalizations about all assemblies, and that the efforts to associate a particular uprising or mobilization with democracy itself is a temptation as thrilling as it is erroneous. It cuts short the conflictual process through which the idea of the people is articulated and negotiated. In some ways, the problem is epistemological. Can we ever really know who the we is who assembles on the street, and whether any given assembly really represents the people as such? And whether any given assembly can represent what we mean by freedom of assembly as such? Every example seems to fail, and yet certain themes tend to recur, such that we can reapproach the way the claim of we the people is made. Sometimes it is quite explicitly a battle over words, political signifiers, or even descriptions. But prior to any group starting to debate that language, there is a coming together of bodies that speak, as it were, in another way. Assemblies assert and enact themselves by speech or silence, by action or steady inaction, by gesture, movement, gathering, organized by an infrastructure, and they are visible, audible, tangible, exposed in ways that are deliberate and unwilled, both, interdependent in forms both organized and spontaneous. So let's assume from the start that it is not by way of a particular and punctual speech act that a group comes together as a people. We don't just say, we the people, and then suddenly the people emerge or exist as the effect of a magical performative. Although we often think that the declarative speech act by which we the people consolidates its popular sovereignty is one that issues from such an assembly, it's perhaps more appropriate to say that the assembly is already speaking, or rather signifying, before it utters any words, and that by coming together, it's already an enactment of the popular will. That enactment signifies quite differently from the way a single and unified subject does, who declares its will through a vocalized proposition. The we, voiced in language, is already enacted by the gathering of bodies, their gestures and movements, their vocalizations, and their ways of acting in concert. To act in concert does not mean to act in conformity. It may be that people are moving or speaking in several directions at once, even at cross purposes. And it does not mean that, whoever the people may be, that they speak the exact same words, although sometimes that happens in a chant or in a verbal relay, as in Occupy public assemblies. And sometimes the people act by way of their collective silence or their ironic use of language, their humor, and even their mockery. They take up and take over a language they seek to derail from its usual ends. Already then, there are 2 points I wish to underscore. The first is that the actions by which people assemble and assert themselves to be a people may be spoken or enacted in another way. The second is that we have to be able to think of such acts as plural action, presupposing a plurality of bodies who enact their convergent and divergent purposes in ways that fail to conform to a single kind of acting or reduce to a single kind of claim. An issue for us will be the question of how politics changes when the idea of abstract rights vocally claimed by individuals gives way to a plurality of embodied actors who enact their claims, sometimes through language, sometimes not. So let's consider how we might, in light of this shift in framework, understand freedom of assembly. In what sense is it a right, and how is it claimed? As a right, what does it presuppose about who we are and who we might be? The right to exercise the freedom of assembly is by now well documented in international law. For instance, the International Labor Organization makes explicit that rights to assembly, or what they call associational rights, are tied to the rights of collective bargaining. This means that people assemble in order to negotiate the conditions of their work, including demands for safety, job security, fair wages, protection against exploitation, but also the right to collective bargaining itself. The right assembles workers together. No one has a right of assembly without a group of others who are in a structurally similar position in relation to the workplace, the workforce. In some human rights discourses, the freedom of assembly is described as a fundamental form of freedom that deserves to be protected by government, which means that governments are obligated to protect that freedom. Paradoxically, governments must protect the freedom of assembly against governmental interference, which is a way of saying that governments are under strict obligations, according to this human rights framework, to restrain themselves from constraining or attacking the rights of assembly through the illegitimate use of police and judicial powers to detain or arrest, harass, threaten, censor, imprison, injure, or kill. As we can see, there's a rather strong risk in this formulation from the start. Does freedom of assembly depend upon being protected by government, or does it depend upon a protection from government? If it's the latter, on what basis or from what source does it derive that protection? Does it make sense for the people to rely on government to protect itself from government? Does the right only exist if a government confers this right, and to the extent that a government agrees to protect that right? If so, then the destruction of those rights of assembly by a government cannot be opposed by asserting the rights of assembly. We can agree that freedom of assembly cannot be found in natural law, but is it still in some important way independent of any and every government? Does freedom of expression, so we don't have to be a natural law theorist, nor do we have to be a positivist, okay? That's the part of Hannah Arendt I just adore. Okay. Does freedom of assembly and even freedom of expression, in fact, exceed, even defy, those acts of government by which they are protected and or violated? These rights do not and cannot depend on governmental protection in those cases when the legitimacy of a government and the power of the state is being contested precisely by such an assembly, or when a specific state has contravened the rights of assembly such that its population can no longer freely congregate without threat of state interference, including military and police brutality. Moreover, when the power of the state to protect rights becomes identified with the power of the state to withdraw that very protection, and people exercise freedom of assembly to contest that form of arbitrary and illegitimate power, something in or of freedom of assembly moves outside the jurisdiction of the state. Some would say that freedom of assembly in those cases contests the sovereignty of the state, where state sovereignty implies the capacity to withdraw protection of the rights of populations or members of populations. That may be true, but perhaps what is being opposed is the idea that freedom of assembly itself can be lost as a right when the state opposes the aims of that assembly and seeks to outlaw assembly itself. That happens, as we know, when the state becomes engaged in facilitating the expansion of markets and turning its own services over to financial institutions, transforming public entitlements into consumer goods or investment opportunities. The anti-privatization movement seeks to stop the saturation of the state in market forces, and such movements often happen in tandem with a call to question the legitimacy of a government that has either assumed authoritarian powers or that imposes arbitrary and illegitimate restrictions on public assembly. In those cases in which privatization and authoritarianism are publicly opposed, the state uses its military, police, and legal powers to suppress the freedom of assembly and other such potentially revolutionary freedoms that seek to stop the process of privatization. So freedom of assembly is something other, I want to say, than a specific right allocated and protected by existing governments or nation states. That is why, although there are many excellent studies on the history of freedom of assembly in the United States, they do not always give us insight into transnational forms of alliances or global networks, such as the Occupy movement. If we restrict the analysis of freedom of assembly to a particular national history of that right, we may unwittingly imply that the right only exists insofar as the state confers and protects that right and agrees not to withdraw it. That, of course, turns out to be, so we may then, I want to suggest, depend upon the continuation of the nation state to secure the efficacy of that right. But if freedom of assembly is something other than that right, especially when it calls into question that nation state, it has to have another basis. If it turns out to be true that by freedom of assembly, the nation state, it can turn out to be true that the freedom of assembly that the nation state is obligated to protect is also one which, if collectively exercised, could bring down the state or contest its legitimacy. I take it that this is what is meant when Arendt and others see in freedom of assembly a recurrence of the right of revolution. Still, even if a particular regime contains or protects such a right, it seems to me that the freedom of assembly has to precede and exceed any form of government that confers and protects that right of assembly. So here I want to say that freedom of assembly is prior to any right of assembly, and that freedom of assembly precedes and exceeds any form of government. I say this not to affirm forms of permanent anarchy, and certainly not to condone forms of mob rule, but only to suggest that freedom of assembly may well be a precondition of politics itself, one that presumes that bodies can move and gather in unregulated ways, enacting their political demands in a space that is public, or becomes public, or redefines the public in crucial ways. That assembly sometimes can be called the people, or it may just be one version of the people. After all, the people do not speak in one voice or even in one language. They are, I presume, beings with the capacity to move with whatever technical and infrastructural supports they require to do so. This is, importantly, an insight from disability studies that has concrete implications for thinking through public assembly. And that means that they can, the people can, resolve to stand still, not to move, even to become immovable in their desires and their demands. The power to move or be still, to speak, to act, belongs to the assembly prior to and in excess of whatever rights a particular government decides to confer or to protect. The coming together of a crowd has, as John Inatsu contends, an expressive function prior to any particular claim or utterance that that crowd makes. That very power of government may well become what freedom of assembly opposes, and at that moment we see the operation of a form of popular sovereignty that is distinct from state sovereignty, and whose task it is to distinguish itself from the latter. How, then, do we think about freedom of assembly and popular sovereignty? I know that some people have come to consider sovereignty a bad word, one that associates politics with a singular subject and a form of executive power with territorial claims. Sometimes it's used as synonymous with mastery, and other times with subordination. Perhaps it carries other connotations, though, that we would not want to lose altogether. One only needs to consider debates about native sovereignty in Canada or read the important work of J. Kealani Kanali on the paradoxes of Hawaiian sovereignty to see how crucial this notion can be for popular mobilizations. Sovereignty can be one way of describing acts of political self-determination, which is why popular movements of indigenous people struggling for sovereignty have become important ways to lay claim to space, to reclaim space, to move freely, to express views, to seek reparation and justice. Although elections are the way that government officials are supposed to represent popular sovereignty, or the popular will more specifically, the meaning of popular sovereignty has never been fully exhausted by the act of voting. Of course, voting is essential for any concept of popular sovereignty, but the exercise of sovereignty neither begins nor ends with the act of voting. As democratic theorists have argued for some time, elections do not fully transfer the sovereignty from the populace to its elected representatives. Something of popular sovereignty always remains untransferable, marking the outside of the electoral process. If not, there would be no popular means of objecting to corrupt electoral processes. In a sense, the power of the populace, the people, remains separate from the power of those elected, even after they have elected them, for only in its separateness Can it continue to contest the conditions and results of elections as well as the actions of elected officials? If the sovereignty of the people is fully transferred to and replaced by those whom the majority elect, then what is lost are those powers we call critical, those actions we call resistance, and the lived possibility we call revolution. So popular sovereignty certainly translates into electoral power when the people vote, but it's never a full or adequate translation. Something of popular sovereignty remains untranslatable, non-transferable, even unsubstitutable, which is why it can both elect and dissolve regimes. As much as popular sovereignty legitimates parliamentary forms of power, it also retains the power to withdraw its support from those same forms when they prove to be illegitimate. If parliamentary forms of power require popular sovereignty for their very legitimacy, they also surely fear it, for there is something about popular sovereignty that runs counter to and exceeds or outruns every parliamentary form that it institutes and grounds. An elected regime can be brought to a halt or overcome by that assembly of people who speak in the name of the people, enacting the very we who holds final legitimating power under conditions of democratic rule. In other words, the conditions of democratic rule depend finally on an exercise of popular sovereignty that's never fully contained or expressed by any particular democratic order, but which remains the condition of its democratic character. This is an extra parliamentary power, without which no parliament can function legitimately, and which threatens every parliament with dysfunction or even dissolution. We may want to call it an anarchist interval, or a permanent principle of revolution that resides within democratic orders, one that shows up more or less, both at moments of founding and of dissolution, but it also operates in the freedom of assembly itself. Well, all this may seem clear enough, although you may not agree, and that's fine, but a difficult and persistent question remains: who are the people? Have we yet posed that question? I'm aware this topic has been amply discussed by Jacques Derrida, Barney Honig, Etienne Balibar, Ernesto Laclau, Jacques Rancière, and others. I don't purport to add anything new to those debates at this time. All I want to underscore is that we cannot simply rely on a snapshot to confirm their numbers. We have a number. Who are the people captured by this snapshot? We cannot simply turn to aerial photographs taken by police charged with managing crowds on the street, for that would really make the people into a matter of demographic forensics. That photograph would doubtless have a frame, and that frame would both include and exclude what it ostensibly captures. The same would be true of a video that starts and ends somewhere and is always limited by the perspective by which its object is selectively crafted. One thing we know is that not all the people assemble in the street, or at least not on the same street. Zooming in and zooming out won't help us here, since those are precisely ways of editing and selecting what and who will count, which means we cannot separate the question of who the people are from the technology that establishes which people will count as the people, the technology that establishes who can and will appear. Perhaps the people exceed every visual frame that seeks to capture the people. Sometimes the people or some people are confined or absent or outside the purview of the street and the camera. The prison is surely a case in point. It never really happens that all of the possible people who are represented by the notion of the people show up in the same space and at the same time to claim that, yes, they are the people, as if they were all free to move, as if they all had, of their own volition, would arrive together in some space and time that can be described or photographed in some all-inclusive way. Indeed, I think it would be odd, if not terrifying, to imagine every member of the group called the people coming together and speaking in unison. That would be a fantasy, if not a potentially persecutory phantasm, whose seductive power is linked with its fundamental unrealizability. Usually we associate such forms of unanimous speaking, in which everyone's saying the same thing, with forms of fascism or other compulsory forms of conformity. In fact, we the people, the utterance, the chant, or the written line, is always missing some group of people it claims to represent. Some group failed to show up or are constrained from doing so, Many live on the margins of the metropole. Some are congregated on the border in refugee camps, waiting for documentation, transfer, shelter, yet others are in prison or detained in camps. Those who are situated elsewhere may, if they can, be saying something else if they are texting or blogging or functioning through new media. They are emphatically or indifferently not speaking at all. This means that the people never really arrive as a collective presence that speaks as a verbal chorus. Whoever the people may be, they are surely internally divided, appearing differentially or sequentially, or not at all, or in degree. Probably also, in some measure, both gathered and dispersed, and so ultimately not a unity. In fact, as we know from the summer demonstrations in both Turkey and Egypt, one group gathers one place and claims to be the people. Another group gathers across the way and makes the same claim. Or in Palestine, a large group in forced exile claims to be a legitimate part of the Palestinian people, and yet most of Israel disagrees. Access to any public square presupposes access to some media that relays the events outside of that space and time. The public square is now partially established as a media effect, but also part of the enunciatory apparatus by which a group of people claims to be the people. The connection of the public square with the media that circulates the event means that connection implies that the people disperse as they gather. The media image shows and disseminates the gathering. This implies the need to radically rethink the public square as always already dispersed through the media representation without which it loses its representative claim. It also means that whoever the people may be is not quite known or knowable, and not only because the media frame limits and morphs the idea of the people it relays. What is known is that the people, whoever they may be, are divided about who they are. The contest over the name becomes a hegemonic struggle, and the people seems to be another name for that contest. So what follows? A people do not need to be united on every issue, cannot be. Neither do they all have to gather in a single space for concerted action to take place in the name of the people. That name, the people, even the declaration, we the people, doesn't quite capture what the people do, for there's always something other than the group that has formed and appeared and seems to be speaking. There are always more than those who can appear and speak. Precisely because there's a gap between what happens in the name of the people and what the people want, we have to rethink what we mean by the people. Not all the people want the same thing or want it in the same way. This failure does not need to be lamented. The name of the people is appropriated, contested, renewed, always at risk of being expropriated or dismissed, and the fragility and ferocity that marks the hegemonic struggle over the name are but signs of its democratic operation. So even as some speaker or set of speakers invoke a we who fairly and fully represents all the people, the plural we cannot really do what it nevertheless does. Speakers may surely continue to strive for more inclusive aims, underscoring the aspirational character of the we, saying, when I say we, I'm not describing an existing people, but I'm holding out the pronoun as an open-ended futural moment, linguistic moment, under which all the people might eventually gather. But if the we is to work politically, it has to be restricted to those who attempt to achieve and exercise hegemonic power through its invocation. Indeed, those who assemble as the we, presenting themselves as the people, are not finally representing the people, they're performing several functions at once. For instance, if they can vote, they provide the legitimating ground of those who do come to represent the people. But perhaps equally importantly, the claim of elected officials to be representative requires the condensation of the people into a set of votes that can be tallied as a majority. In this sense, the people are abbreviated and nearly lost at the moment in which they elect those who represent them. And political representation thus abbreviates, quantifies something we might call the will of the people. At the same time, however, something emphatically non-electoral is also at work. The people who speak the we or enact the we within the electoral process, outside it or against it, constitute themselves as the people in the course of enacting or vocalizing that plural pronoun, either literally or figuratively. Standing together in the face of the police can be precisely an enactment of that plural pronoun without saying a word. And I think one could see this with the example of the standing man in Gezi Park in Istanbul last summer, when there was a state edict against moving in groups together, right? You know, people were not allowed to move in groups together in Gezi Park. And so one man, performance artist, stood, did not move, refused to move, and other people came and stood near him, did not move, refused to move, until hundreds and hundreds of people had gathered in the park, standing silent, not moving, obeying the law, obeying the law. But the police did come and rifle through their pockets, you know, make sure, you know, look at their electronic equipment. I want to suggest that these ways of coming together, these modes of plural self-constitution are not the same as representing a people who are already fully formed. The term "the people" doesn't only represent a pre-existing collection. If it did, the term would postdate the production of the collectivity itself. The term can never adequately represent a collectivity that is in the process of being made or that is making itself through the use of the term. In fact, the inadequacy of the term, its self-division, are part of its enacted meaning and, indeed, its promise. The discursive invocation of the we refers then to a people whose needs, desires, and demands are not yet fully known or articulated, and whose coming together is bound up with a future that is yet to be lived out. Indeed, the practices of self-determination are not quite the same as acts of self-representation, and yet both of these are at work in exercising the freedom of assembly, in which we the people is spoken or enacted in some way. Indeed, both of these are at work in what I'm calling popular sovereignty. This kind of enactment is performative inasmuch as it brings the people into being whom it names, or it calls upon them to gather under the utterance. And this means that it is part of a process of self-determination, an active determining of the plural self, we might say, a designation of who we are that is also at the same time the making of that we. The invocation of we separates popular sovereignty from state sovereignty. It names and inaugurates that separation time and again. The plurality always breaks with those who are elected or whose election is questionable to us, or in relation to a state, or acts in relation to a state whose representatives we have never had the choice to elect, as is the clear case under occupation, and for the undocumented and the partial or non-citizen. So something must fail as representation, something we might call non-representational and non-representative, something merely tautological. This something becomes the basis of democratic forms of political self-determination, popular sovereignty distinct from state sovereignty, or rather popular sovereignty precisely as it intermittently distinguishes itself from state sovereignty. I'm suggesting that popular sovereignty makes sense only in this perpetual act of separating from state sovereignty, and it's a way of forming a people through acts of self-designation, self-gathering, self-enactment, where the self has to be conceived as a plural self. These are repeated enactments, verbal and nonverbal, bodily and virtual, undertaken across different spatial and temporal zones and on different kinds of public stages, virtual realities, and shadow regions. The vocalized performative we the people is surely part of this enactment we're calling self-constitution, but this verbal figure cannot be taken as a literal account of how political self-determination works. Not every act of political self-determination can be translated into that verbal utterance. Such a move would make the verbal domain more privileged than any other. In fact, the enactment of political self-determination is necessarily a crossing of the linguistic and the bodily, even if the action is silent and the body is sequestered. How, for instance, do we understand the hunger strike, if not precisely as the practiced refusal of a body that cannot appear in public, a mode of self-determination that does not appear and is not heard? This means that appearing in public in a bodily form is not an adequate figure for political self-determination. At the same time, the hunger strike that is not reported and represented in public space fails to convey the power of the act itself. Prisoner networks are precisely those forms of solidarity that cannot appear in public in a bodily form, relying predominantly on digital media reports with few, if any, images. Those networks of prisoners, activists, lawyers, and extended kin and social relations, whether in Turkey, in Palestinian prisons and detention camps, or at Pelican Bay in California, are also forms of assembly, I want to argue, in which those with suspended citizenship still exercise a form of freedom through strikes, petitions, forms of legal and political representation. Even as they cannot appear, are not allowed to appear in public space, that is what it means to be imprisoned, they are nevertheless exercising a certain right to appear in public, out of the public eye, either before the law or through such networks, objecting precisely to the interdiction against appearing that is the condition of imprisonment. All right, given all this, let's recapitulate what it means and does not mean for rethinking freedom of assembly in relation to popular sovereignty. First of all, popular sovereignty, I want to suggest, is a form of reflexive self-making, where the self is plural. And this mode of reflexive self-making is separate from the very representative regime it legitimates, and it arises in the course of separating from state sovereignty. Popular sovereignty cannot legitimate any particular regime without being separate from it, that is, partially uncontrolled by that regime and not operationalized as its mere instrument. And yet, popular sovereignty forms the basis of legitimate government, usually through fair and inclusive elections, and its act of self-making is actually, I want to suggest, a series of spatially distributed acts, ones that do not always operate in the same way for the same purposes. Among the most important of those spatial distinctions is that between the public sphere and spheres of forcible confinement, including the prison, where political prisoners, those who have exercised freedom of assembly and or freedom of speech, are contained and subjugated and deprived of those very freedoms. This passage into and out of the public sphere is regulated precisely by legal and police power and the institution of the prison. And finally, the enactment of we, the people, may or may not take linguistic form. Both speech and silence, movement and immobility are all political enactments. The hunger strike is precisely the inverse of the fed body standing freely in the public domain, speaking, acting, moving, standing still. It marks and resists the deprivation of that right. It enacts and exposes, the hunger strike does, the deprivation that prison populations suffer. Enactments, I'd like to suggest, are not fully reducible to assertions. Assertions are but one form of enactment, which is why the sphere of political performativity includes and exceeds verbal and written utterances. In this way, I seek to draw upon Jason Frank's important formulation of constituent moments when the enactment of the people exceeds its representation. In his view, the people must be enacted to be represented, and yet no enactment can succeed in representing them. In his view, this dissonance between enactment and representation proves to be a core paradox of democratic assemblies. This formulation might usefully be supplemented by another, namely, that a differential form of power establishes who may be part of such an enactment and the means and methods of such enactments. Since the public sphere is constituted in part through sites of forcible sequestering, defined negatively by sites of forcible sequestering, the borders that define the public are also those which define the confined, the sequestered, the imprisoned, the expelled, and the disappeared. Whether we're speaking about the borders of the nation-state, where the undocumented are confined within refugee encampments, where rights of citizenship are denied or indefinitely suspended, or prisons where indefinite detention has become the norm, the interdiction against appearing and moving and speaking in public becomes the precondition of embodied life. The prison is not exactly the inverse of the public sphere, since prisoner advocacy networks traverse the walls of the prison. Forms of prisoner resistance, networks of prisoner resistance are, or participate in, modes of enactment that by definition cannot be part of the public square, though through networks of communication and proxy representation they surely can. No matter how virtual we want to think of the public sphere, and there are many good reasons for thinking that, the prison remains the limit case of the public sphere, marking the power of the state to control who can pass into the public and who must pass out of it. As long as the state controls the very conditions of freedom of assembly, then popular sovereignty becomes an instrument of state sovereignty, and the legitimating conditions of the state are lost at the same time that the freedom of assembly has been robbed of both its critical and democratic function. I would add here that if we assume that popular sovereignty depends on state sovereignty, and we think that the sovereign state maintains control through its power to make an exception, who will be covered, who will not, over which part of the population will be protected by law and which will not, then we've unwittingly perhaps reduced that power of popular sovereignty to bare life, or to a form of anarchism that presupposes a break with state sovereignty. But if that break is already there within popular sovereignty, or if popular sovereignty is that recurrent break, then the reduction of popular sovereignty to state sovereignty covers over and displaces that most important potential, one that a large number of popular movements struggling for self-determination affirm as their ultimate organizing principle. So what I want to say is, if we take this kind of Schmittian view, which has become so popular, that that sovereignty is state sovereignty, and that it is the power to grant the exception or to withdraw protection, then we imagine the population from whom state sovereignty has withdrawn protection as outside of the political field itself, as a kind of bare life that Agamben talks about. But in fact, what I think happens there is that we fail to see what the forms of resistance are and what the modes of enactment are precisely under conditions of disposability and abandonment, and we rob that population of its agency. Okay, that's my polemical point. Whether we're speaking about okay. The invocation of the people becomes and must become contestable at the very moment it appears. I think we started this afternoon with the claim that the actions by which people assemble and assert themselves may be spoken or enacted in ways that include inaction and stillness. I made a second point, which is that we have to be able to think of such acts as plural action, presupposing a plurality of bodies who enact their convergent purpose in ways that do not require strict conformity. And who do not act as a single subject. I've now started to add a third claim, which is that the prison is the limit case of the public sphere, and that freedom of assembly is haunted by the possibility of imprisonment. There is no freedom of assembly that is not haunted or made anxious by the possibility of imprisonment. One may be imprisoned for what one says, or one may be imprisoned simply by assembling. Or one may be imprisoned for writing or teaching about assemblies or about freedom struggles, or by teaching about popular struggles for sovereignty, such as teaching about the Kurdish freedom movement in Turkish universities. I can name at least 4 professors who have been imprisoned for either teaching about the Kurdish freedom movement or agreeing to supervise dissertations on the theme. All of these are reasons why those with the freedom to appear can never fully or adequately represent the people, since there are people who are always missing from the public, missing from this public assembled, say, in Gezi Park or elsewhere. They are those who must find representation, even as those who seek to represent them risk imprisonment for doing so. And it's not just that there are some people who happen to be missing from any particular gathering, they had something else to do. Rather, there are those who could not have gathered in, say, Gezi Park, or who can no longer gather, or who are indefinitely restrained from gathering. That very power of confinement is a way of defining, producing, and controlling what will be the public sphere and who will be admitted to public assembly. It works alongside privatization as a process that seeks to make public space into the entrepreneurial field of the market-driven state. So though we may wonder why it is that crowds that gather to oppose privatization are broken up and dispersed by police force, gassing, and physical assault, we have to remember that the state which is offloading public space to private enterprise, or that now makes such decisions according to market values, is involved in at least two ways of controlling and decimating public space. Some lament that a movement that begins with opposing privatization inevitably becomes a movement that opposes police violence. But let's try to see that the seizure of public space from the domain of popular sovereignty is precisely the aim of both privatization and police assaults on freedom of assembly. In this way as well, the market and the prison work together in a prison industry, which, as Angela Davis has clearly shown, works to regulate rights of citizenship. And in the United States, this happens in irrefutably racist ways as Black men continue to constitute the vast majority of prisoners. We can add that they work together as well to constrict and decimate and appropriate public space where we might expect to find that what Hannah Arendt has called the right to appear. That said, I want to return to the theoretical point about freedom of assembly, just in the final part of this talk, in order to suggest some of the political implications of how we think. My inquiry began with a question in what sense freedom of assembly is a punctual expression of popular sovereignty, and whether it has to be understood as a performative exercise, or what Jason Frank calls the small dramas of self-authorization. I began by suggesting that the performative power of the people does not rely only on words. Assembly makes sense only if bodies can and do gather or connect in some way. And speech acts that unfold from there articulate something that is already happening at the level of the plural body. So let's remember that vocalization is also a bodily act, as is sign language, and this means that there's no speaking without the body signifying something, and sometimes the body signifies something quite different from what a person actually says. Indeed, we wouldn't have psychoanalysis without that. If the plural subject is constituted in the course of its performative action, then it's not already made, it's not already given. Whatever form it has prior to its performative exercise is not the same as the form it takes as it acts and after it has acted. So how do we understand this movement of gathering, durational, occasional, periodic, or definitive? It is not one act, but a convergence of actions different from one another, a form of political sociality irreducible to conformity. And even when a crowd speaks together, they have to gather in close enough proximity to hear someone else's voice, to pace one's own vocalization, achieve rhythm and harmony to a sufficient degree, and so to achieve a relation both auditory and corporeal with those with whom some signifying action or speech act is undertaken. We start to speak now and stop now. We start to move now, or more or less at a given time, but certainly not as a single organism. We try to stop all at once, but some keep moving, and others move and rest at their own pace. Temporal seriality, coordination, bodily proximity, auditory range, coordinated vocalization, all of these constitute essential dimensions of assembly and demonstration. And they also are presupposed by the speech act that enunciates we the people. They're the complex elements of the occasion of that enunciation, the non-verbal conditions of its operation. If we try to take vocalization as the model of the speech act or as the political performative, then the body is surely presupposed as the organ of speech, both the organic condition and vehicle. The body's not transmuted into pure thought when it speaks. It continues to signify the organic conditions of verbalization, which means, according to Shoshana Fellman, that the speech act is always doing something more and other than what it is actually saying. The embodied character of the plural people proves quite important to the kinds of demands that are made, since it's more often than not that basic bodily needs are not being met by virtue of devastated ways of life under contemporary neoliberalism, under conditions of privatization, or under situations of enormous economic scarcity. When, for instance, wealth is accumulated among 2% of the population and increasing numbers of people lose their homes and employment, then the people are clearly divided along class lines, and economic power is distributed in radically unequal ways. When those who face accelerating prospects of precarity take to the streets and begin their claim with we the people, then they are asserting that they, those who appear and speak there, are identified as the people. They're working to ward off the prospect of oblivion, of becoming forgotten, of having lives that become fully irrecoverable. The phrase does not imply that those who profit are not the people, they're the people too, and it does not necessarily imply a simple sense of inclusion. It asserts rather a form of equality in the face of increasing inequality, and does this not simply by uttering the phrase, but by embodying equality to whatever extent that proves possible, constituting an assembly of the people on the grounds of equality. One might say that equality is experimentally and provisionally asserted in the midst of increasing inequality. Or at least we could say that this is one idea of what happened in the Occupy movement or in the early days of Tahrir Square when communities formed and tried to organize themselves on principles of equality. Of course, critics respond, oh, all this is vain and useless, since they're actually symbolic, and true economic equality continues to become more elusive for those whose debts are astronomical and employment prospects foreclosed. Those are just little experimental occasions. What we really need is structural transformation. It seems to me, however, that the embodiment of equality in the practices of assembly and the insistence on interdependency and a fair distribution of labor tasks, even the notion of a commonly held ground or the commons, all start to put into the world, all start to articulate into a public discourse a version of equality that is precisely the one that is rapidly vanishing in other quarters and that has prompted people to get together to begin with. The point is not to regard here the body merely as an instrument for making a political claim, but to let the body, or rather bodies, become the precondition and the object of political claims. After all, what is at stake? Jobs, shelter, health, food. Indeed, in the politics of the street that has been with us in the last years, Porta del Sol, Geze, the favela movement in Brazil, the basic requirements of the body are at the center of political mobilizations. Those requirements are, in fact, publicly enacted prior to any set of political demands, but it's also because they are the object of political mobilization. Over and against the forces of privatization, the destruction of public services, and the destruction of ideals of the public good precipitated by neoliberal forms of governance, bodies require, demand food, shelter, protection from injury and violence, the freedom to move, to work, to have access to health care. They require other bodies for support and for survival and for flourishing. It matters what age those bodies are, whether they are able-bodied, since in all forms of dependencies, bodies require not just one other person, but social systems of support that are complexly human and technical. Such systems of support are precisely what are being decimated by privatization, neoliberalism, and austerity measures, but also by systemically induced global inequalities. So it's precisely in a world in which the bodily life of increasing numbers of people is proving to be highly precarious that bodies now emerge together on the pavement or the dirt or along the wall that separates them from their land. And these assemblies, which can include virtual participants, still assume a set of interlocking locations for a plural set of bodies. The bodies, we might say, belong to the pavement on which they gather, the ground, the architecture, the technology by which they live and move and work and desire. Thus, we cannot speak about bodies without the environments, the machines, the complex systems of social interdependency, which are their conditions of support, their conditions for flourishing. Although there are those who'll say, yes, I like this, active bodies assembled on the street constitute a powerful and surging multitude, one that in itself constitutes a radical democratic event or action, right? And all we really want are punctual events, and that's the best we can hope from democracy. I can only partially agree with that view. When the people break off from established power, they enact the popular will, though to know that for certain, we would have to know who is breaking off and where, and who does not break off and where they are. There are, of course, all sorts of surging multitudes I would not want to endorse, even if I do not dispute their right to surge. And they would include, but some of them I would contest their rights: lynch mobs, anti-Semitic or racist or fascist congregation, violent forms of anti-parliamentary mass movements. I'm less concerned with the ostensible vitality of surging multitudes or any nascent and promising life force that seems to belong to their collective action than joining the struggle to establish more sustaining conditions of livability in the face of systematically induced precarity and forms of racial and class destitution. The final aim of politics is not simply to surge forth together, although this can be an essential moment of affective intensity within a broader struggle against precarity, constituting a new lived sense of the people, even if sometimes for the purposes of radical democratic change, which I do endorse, it is important to surge forth in ways that claim and alter the attention of the world for some more enduring possibility of livable life for all. It's one thing to feel alive episodically, or even to affirm aliveness. I think that's good. And yet another to say that that fleeting sense is all that we can expect from politics. Feeling alive is not quite the same as struggling for a world in which life becomes livable for those who have not yet been valued as living beings. Although I understand that something has to hold such a group together, some demand, some felt sense of injustice and unlivability, some shared intimation of the possibility of change, and that change has to be fueled by a resistance to minimally existing and expanding economic inequalities, ever-increasing conditions of precarity for many populations both locally and globally, forms of authoritarian and securitarian control that seek to suppress democratic processes and mass movements and state and institutional racism. I understand something has to hold such groups together. But it matters how we think about that. On the one hand, there are bodies that assemble on the street or online or through other less visible networks of solidarity, especially in prisons, whose political claims are made through forms of solidarity that may or may not appear directly in public space. On the other hand, there are mobilizations that emerge in public to make their claims through language, action, gesture, and movement, through linking arms, through refusing to move, to forming bodily modes of obstruction to police and state authorities. Sometimes we love each other, sometimes we hate each other, sometimes we have a steadfast indifference to the one we stand next to, but with whom we are nevertheless joined in an important action that guides us both. A given movement can move in and out of the space of heightened exposure depending on its strategies and the military and police threats it faces. But in each of these cases, we can say that these bodies form networks of resistance together, remembering those bodies who are active agents of resistance, bodies who are active agents of resistance are also fundamentally in need of support and are also struggling in support for the support they need. In resistance, vulnerability is not precisely converted into agency. It remains the condition of resistance, and in acts of bodily assembly, including the bodily exposure to police forces, vulnerability is mobilized as a political instrument. So this way of talking about vulnerability, I want to suggest, implies something other than weakness or victimization. For the precarious, acts of resistance set forth the abandoned or unsupported dimensions of life at the same time that they form and reform a political we, the complex subject of plural action, whose bodily acts speak in ways that are different from speech, but no less effective. Thank you very much.
There's a microphone up here. If you want to ask Judith Butler a question.
You can speak or you can act.